Today we are going through the old main line of the Caro-Kann with knight to c3 or knight d2 takes and knight takes e4. And we'll be exploring not just the old main line of bishop f5, but the modern main line knight f6 and also Karpov's knight d7. All these moves we'll be going into in some depth. And by the end of this video, you're going to have a pretty good idea of the best options for both sides and the main ideas and plans. So let's dive right in. After bishop g6, h4, you'll kind of notice that white's most critical plans against bishop f5 are usually going to be associated with going after this bishop in some way. So the move knight d7 to stop that also kind of makes sense. And after h5, this is kind of how the old main line of the Capablanca variation with bishop f5 goes, where basically the move of bishop d2 is kind of the more common move since, let's say, the early 2010s or so, just avoiding anything like queen a5 check, where black is sort of able to kind of provoke this c3 and c4, so that if white does castle long, the black will then sort of have this b5 as sort of an objective counterplay against the white king. And of course, if you were to play c5 in response, that also gives d5 to the knight. So it's kind of hard to avoid making some small concession there, and moves like d5 also just going to be worked out to a very solid equality in the arising endgame. So that's kind of why bishop d2 is the main trend these days. And to kind of understand like why the move king b1 is sort of a popular move, it's because like if you go knight e4 immediately, you're going to potentially run into a few challenges where the queens might get traded. This pawn comes under fire and black can sort of trade the queen to just get a very reliable endgame. And so when you kind of play a move like king b1, it means that if you kind of take this same sequence with the inclusion of king b1 and castles, well, here the pawn is defended, so white can try to play a more useful move than c4 and going into the endgame that we just saw. They could play a move like knight e5, a more aggressive move to try and attack on the king's side. They could go bishop e3 as sort of a prophylaxis anticipating the move queen e4, because we can, we're not going to have our queen under attack, essentially. So there are different ideas like that which white can use to try to press our tiny sort of advantage. That being said, black can also play a move like queen b6 and, try to just go for an accelerated play on the queen side and in the center, rather. And that's also going to be very hard for white to really get any sort of advantage against. So there's kind of one reason why you'll often see white kind of try to do something a little bit different in these variations these days. Like, for example, if we go back here, the move of bishop d3 is actually a somewhat trendy alternative in the last years. We kind of play where the pawn's on h4 rather than h5. On the one hand, it might look quite nice to fix the structure, but it's also true the h5 pawn can be a bit of a weakness in the endgame, and you can explore this idea for yourself if you're so inclined, even if it turns out that queen a5 probably should eventually equalize. But at least it's a bit of a different position in comparison with the pawn on h4, not quite as explored. So, with that being said, they can also play moves like e6 and allow knight e5. This line is also reasonably reliable for black, you could say. They used to kind of play f4, then they sort of moved on to sort of bishop f4, and lately the move of queen e2 is kind of a trend to kind of keep the game going. And it's sort of the preference of the engine as well, but you can sort of explore the details in your own time if you're so inclined. Also moves like knight h3 and Kramnik sort of bishop e3, and so having the option of bring knight e2. These ideas do exist as well, even if they're not perhaps objectively the most critical. And also if white does develop quietly, you'll sort of see that black just gets very comfortable play with very natural moves here. There's just absolutely nothing to fear in these kinds of structures. Of course, the bishop will also be well placed on d6. It's a matter of taste, but let's say if white does try to go after the bishop on g6, but trying to bring the knight to f4 and then go for this sort of thing. Knight f6 just ends up being a pretty good reply, because moves like queen c7 is often very annoying. Like white might even play a move like c3 here in order to, not have the c2 pawn just be hanging. But then black's kind of in time to get his counterplay in the center. We're just not really in time to get an h4, h5 ourselves. Even if we do, they could still perhaps put the bishop on c2 in some cases, and black's just going to be fine. By the way, if you've been enjoying this video so far, do make sure to hit that like button. If you're somewhat more new to the channel, then do go ahead and subscribe as well. But actually the main trend these days has been the Korchnoi variation with knight f6 and the move e takes f6 here. And basically the idea is just to have this very healthy development of the king side, something like this. But it's recently been sort of revived in the last 6 or so years by this very fresh idea, where rather than playing a move like g6 and giving h4, h5 as a hook for the attack, or a passive move like h6, it turns out that h5 is actually the best move for black in this position, which might look weird the first time that you see it, but that's the point that h-pawn can also be used to try to create attacking chances against the white king, and so h3 does stop that, it would seem, but black does still have a very healthy position where it's kind of hard to really get at the pawn on h4, and much like we kind of saw in that h5, h6 setup in the Capablanca variation, we also kind of see here black does have ideas of potentially going queen d6 at the right moment and making things a little bit awkward for the king. Of course, there's a lot more theory and there are plenty of other moves that can also be played here. But the point sort of remains that, yeah, it's certainly a very healthy position for black, with also some chance of counterplay, which is why it's such a trendy variation at the top level for the last years. And rather realizing that that final position doesn't really give white that much of an edge, it has led to white looking for alternative directions like bishop to f4 and knight f4 as ways just to try to get a game. But though it is true that black should also be quite fine in these positions. If white does try to castle long and argue that this pawn could end up being a bit of a hook, it just doesn't really turn out that way in practice. Black just really doing very well in these positions. Like, even if you get this in, you can always shut it down with h4. And c4 rook c8 again kind of opens the door for that b5 as a hook to create counterplay against not just the queen but also the white king. And overall, black, I think, is just very, very comfortable in a position like this. There's one reason why in some of my games I actually like to avoid queen e2 altogether, as a way to sort of negate the move of h5 to some extent. And there are some interesting ideas where you can play stuff like knight g3, and if black kind of just sticks to the normal plan, you kind of go f4. And it's not going to try to play f5 and just really play against the knight and the bishop. If they flick in c5, you kind of go d5 then, and it's an interesting position where I do think it's easier to play white, even if black should admittedly not be doing all that badly either. But at least we kind of set black a few questions. Now, it's worth pointing out c3 is the main line, but it's definitely not the only way for white to play here. I've tried actually pretty much everything, though I will say that knight f3 is probably not one of the more critical options. Black can either pin the knight with quite good play, or even just play a move like rook e8 first. As if white does stop the pin on the knight, that also kind of opens the door for the knight to kind of end up on a square like f4, where you can't just kick it away so easily, just as a general point. And of course, this is a very healthy position for black as well, even if bishop g4 might be the perhaps slightly more clean equalizer. If they play bishop c4 here, like in this case, white's idea is to sort of go queen e2 and try to disrupt black's setup. I mean, whether you go for the endgame or whether you just keep the queens on the board, either way, black is basically going to be okay here. It's kind of a position where you might have some slight awkwardness with trying to get the rook to e8, but kind of practice has shown this idea of bringing the knight here and preparing this rook e8 is going to allow black to equalize. Also, bishop e3 is a bit of a trendy move where you kind of just play a very similar style to c3, but you're sort of arguing that rather than playing the move of c3, you can kind of go c4 in one go. And again, while the engines think black is doing okay, I think that with knight g3 being maybe a little bit more promising direction than the old line of queen c2, you can still argue that the position may be a bit easier for white to play, and at least we give black a few challenges. The final line I want to mention in this video is the Karpov variation, which I realize we haven't really enough time to fully do justice to, but it's also not really as trendy as the other lines, because, well, for example, if we take like the main line just on the most common moves of takes, well, it turns out that here, black's basically playing for a draw, because if white plays knight e5, the only move really for black to equalize is a move like knight d7, but then white kind of has the option of just going back and forth, and just having a draw if he wants it. And even a move like c3, while black is, I think, definitely not in danger here, and also this kind of endgame is one where it's pretty clear that black is just playing to hold and just make a solid draw, and then white will try to press a little with the bishops, even if black should, of course, be okay here. But it sort of speaks to the fact that, yeah, knight d7 is more of a drawing weapon, which is a reason why I don't really see it be so popular these days. Not to mention also the move knight g5 is theoretically a little bit annoying, and one of the tricks is like h6, knight e6, and you can't take because of the the checkmate, and if you go knight gf6 to prepare it, you still are going to run into a few problems where here white is a little bit better. But if you go knight f6 or queen c7, like either way, there is some little problems where it's just a bit easier to play white. But anyway, that's the overview of the knight c3 Caro-Kann in 10 minutes. Do let me know in the comments below what was your favorite variation of the lines that we looked at. And yeah, with that being said, I will see you in the next video. Good luck with this position in your games, whether you're playing with white or with black. And I will see you in the next one.